Hello and welcome again to the Writer Review. This is Eric Carrot Writer, and this week we're going to be taking a look back at the 1984 sci-fi action movie titled Dune. Now, Dune runs for 2 hours and 17 minutes long. It is directed by David Lynch. It is produced by Raffaella De Laurentiis. The script was written by David Lynch, even though David Lynch actually, even he himself said that to this day, he actually had regretted ever making this movie, and he's actually been unapologetic and vocal about it, and even to this day, he still has a lot of disdain and a lot of regret for ever making this movie. It's just so sad, but it's true. Oh, don't worry, he still continued on with a filmmaking career, still to this day. He had Twin Peaks, he had Blue Velvet, and he had a lot of other movies and TV series under his belt. But Dune, to him, was a nightmare. Don't take my words for it, take his words. The interviews are right there. Alright, it's actually based off of the 1965 novel by Frank Herbert, which was a series of books, and I do think that there was talks of a possible sequel, but since it flopped at the box office, maybe to this day it may have a bit of a cult classic following to it. Still, this movie was a box office failure, and the chances of having a sequel just never materialized. There have been remakes, in 2013, and they also had a recent reboot or a series in 2020, but which probably may have took several pages from the original novel and the sequel follow-ups to it. But in the 80s, after the failure of this movie, they never really followed through because of the failure at the box office. The music was composed by the American band Toto, with the theme song by Brian Eno. The cinematography was done by Freddie Francis, and it was edited by Anthony Gibbs. And the stars of the movie are Kyle McLachlan in his acting debut. We're also joined by Francesca Annis, Sean Young, Jurgen Prochnow, Jose Ferrer, Richard Jordan, Linda Hunt, Virginia Madsen, Captain Picard, Patrick Stewart. I mean, this is actually where Patrick Stewart was getting noticed. I think it was through this movie Dune that inspired the people to do Star Trek The Next Generation. I guess they had in mind was Patrick Stewart in this role, which was where I guess the idea of having Captain Picard played by Patrick Stewart for Star Trek The Next Generation would be like where he started. We also have Everett McGill, Kenneth McMillan, Jack Nance, rock star Sting. We had Dean Stockwell, Max von Sydow, and a very young Alicia Witt. So when I first saw Dune back in 1986, I was only just 8 years old when it was first released. I mean, I was still desperate to watch more sci-fi movies along after the wrapping of Star Trek The Return of the Jedi. I mean, after Star Trek The Return of the Jedi, I didn't think there was going to be another Star Wars follow-up or a prequel or a sequel. Remember, this was back in '84, so the Phantom Menace only started in 1999. So I was still hungry for more sci-fi, and the sci-fi genre was really running very active in the late '70s, early '80s, along with the slasher horror films and the screwball comedies. I knew it in my heart at the time that nothing will compete with the Star Wars franchise at the time, but at least I was hoping that my hunger for sci fi movies would quench my appetite. But when I was 8 years old and I saw the movie Dune, the only thing I got out of it was complete and total boredom. That's right. That's right. It was so confusing. It was so convoluting. You know, I guess maybe I probably would have loved to have seen more action because when it comes to, but then again, when you think about science fiction or sci-fi, it's not just about action. It's not just about grabbing a laser or any kind of weapon artillery and just battling a bunch of evil aliens from some kind of hostile takeover. No, no, no. This story actually definitely is very multi-layered. It has a lot of philosophy. It also has a lot of allegorical elements to it. As I will sort of elaborate as I go along. Now I hadn't seen Dune in 36 years. I mean, man, do I feel like a geriatric saying that? But then again, in 1984, I was only 8 years old. And after watching it again, I was hoping that maybe the much more older adult side of me may see Dune through a different perspective. At this time, all I can say is that it was an intriguing movie, even though it was very badly flawed, but maybe not as flawed as the way David Lynch described it. I mean, I'm not going to sort of go on the path of him, self loathing that he ever regretted ever making this movie. No, I'm not going to go to that direction. I think he's actually selling himself short and is being way too hard on himself. But at the same time, I also didn't think this movie was that bad. Would I call it a cinematic masterpiece? Hardly. There's a lot of flaws. There's a lot of red herrings in this movie. And of course, everybody else also dismissed this movie as being an utter piece of crap. Some people even billed it as the Heaven's Gate of the sci-fi genre. Everybody knows what happened in the movie Heaven's Gate. That movie also flopped so badly that it practically killed the directing career of Michael Cimino, who never recovered after that movie. Well, I can't say that it was a complete the same level as Heaven's Gate because David Lynch actually did recover, but it still was not what you would call box office gold, and people were just way too hard on it. And I could understand that people may have been hard on it because they were probably expecting somewhere in the veins of the Star Wars, Star Trek type franchise. But would you like to know something? A lot of the ideas from the book Dune by Frank Herbert, a lot of the stuff from Star Trek and Star Wars were actually deeply inspired by his works. You know, futuristic stuff. Whether we're living in a utopian society or a dystopian society, a lot of sci-fi futuristic stuff often sometimes either has it in one ways or the other. And, you know, it's kind of heartbreaking that this movie was really badly panned by the media and even the director himself. But when you think about it, Frank Herbert's novel was 600 pages long. And so then you got to ask yourself, how can you cram 600 pages of novel into a movie that's just a little bit over 2 hours and 15 minutes long? You're going to have to take out a lot of scenes. Some of them may be important. You might even have to omit characters, which has often been very commonplace when trying to do a movie based off of a novel that has too many pages. Maybe by today's standards, it would be regarded as a cult classic, which kind of means that we have a new generation of sci-fi lovers who actually say, hey, maybe my generation didn't like this movie, but I'm watching it, and it's not that bad. I mean, yeah, okay. Maybe from a kid's perspective, I was confused because everything felt convoluted, confusing, and I could tell who was who. But then again, I was just an 8-year-old little boy. What do I know? Now I'm 44 years old. Have I changed my mind as to say it's completely boredom? Well, it's still mundane in many areas. But, as I look at this movie today, I'll say that the visuals are very stunning, and I think it's very natural to see the atmosphere being messy in appearance and keeps a lot of visual details like you would expect them to be from the novel. I mean, it does kind of bring the novel to life, and I think that the characters and the portrayals seem to be, for the most part, accurate. There are, like I said, there are a few red herrings here and there, but I don't think it's going to hinder it to the extremities. I didn't give it a 1 out of 10 or anything like that, although I'm not going to give it a 10 out of 10 by any means of the imagination. But I think people were just way too critical in dismissing this movie as nothing but a piece of sci-fi garbage. But I just don't see it that way. Then again, to each their own. There have been a lot of of reasons why people thought this movie was bad because, well, number one, they think that there was a lot of complaints saying that this movie was whitewashed. Yes, I know. I don't like to bring race politics into my broadcast, but unfortunately, maybe they're not completely wrong. Because there's a lot of allegories that could probably make you think that this movie was not really intended to be cast by a predominant Caucasian cat ensemble. And maybe they're not wrong. When I think of this movie, I begin to think it has kind of a more Middle Eastern allegories in this movie. And this movie should have been played with a more diverse cast, or a cast that is of predominant Middle Eastern. I mean, I'm not saying the acting was bad. I'm not saying the performances were bad. Some were hit and miss. And I'm not putting any of the actors down personally. I just sometimes think the casting choice should have been a little more deeply looked into. And yes, although it was directed by an American, so more than likely most of the cast, well, not all the cast, are mostly going to be American or European. But I think maybe this movie would have been better if it would have been casted by Middle Eastern Asians, because there's a lot of stuff that makes me feel like this is more Middle Eastern or Asian than it does sound like something that's Americanized or Europeanized. Another thing too is, the whole idea that this movie has virtually unappealing or unlikable characters in this movie. And that even the person who we're supposed to take umbrage to, turns out that he's not exactly entirely a cookie cutter good guy either. So based on the series of novels written in the 1960s by Frank Herbert, this thin plot is actually quite underwhelming. In the opening scenes, we get an overdone narration from Princess Irulan, played by Virginia Madsen, who tells us way too much of the events going on in only a few minutes. And because of that, it starts to become right away watered down and overkill. You gave us too much of the plot, and now we're practically been spoon-fed, even though we clearly didn't want to be spoon-fed. The story centers around the plant of Arrakis. You see, when you think of Arrakis, the first thing that comes to mind is Iraq. It's set in the future. The year we're going back to is 10,191. What? Human civilization is still there? I thought we could have been wiped out by now. But I guess we're still around. But, it kind of makes me think, if this was the year 10,191, then I got to ask myself, how come we haven't stepped up in terms of technological advances? Shouldn't we also be run by artificial intelligence, or shouldn't we all be sort of all, I don't know, overdone with our technological things? Like, don't we have a robot to put our clothes on? Well, okay, maybe I'm just being silly in that, but still, makes you wonder. How come there's no roads or cars or buildings or skyscrapers or anything like that? A lot of the planets that we see in this movie seem to be pretty much all deserted. And yet everything just feels virtually archaic. It's like, why haven't we stepped up in terms of technological advances? It looks like we've been set back. I mean, I'm thinking of the year 10,191. We should be having technological stuff more way beyond than what we have now. Sometimes I even think that if the year 10,191 exists, our human self-existence should be almost virtually obsolete. And while maybe artificial intelligence should be evolving, the human race should be virtually devolved. Like we're pretty much the human race, or us naturally born human beings, we're practically maybe of little to no use. But anyhow, in the year 10,191, I guess it's still Afro Domini, a spice called melange holds the distinction of being the most powerful substance in the entire universe. So, so this whole thing, this spice, is supposed to be the key to our existence. Now, this could also be a bit of an allegory too, like, so is this spice what would be kind of like synonymous with oil? I mean, when you think about, the most precious commodity or precious resource in our industry, it's oil. I mean, oil is what makes our cars function. Oil is what makes our ways of commuting what substantial. Of course, with oil industry starting to become less significant because it also produces pollutants and the carbon footprint and the Greta Thunbergs. Yes, it does have its damaging effects, but it's still one of the highest resources in our ever so evolving industry. So is the spice kind of like an allegory to that? But then again, when you think about it, this novel was written in 1965, so sometimes I even think maybe the spice could be, well, I don't really want to talk too much in terms of psychedelics, but you never know, there might probably be some kind of a drug or LSD allegory to that as well. So a young heir of the Atreides clan named Paul, played by Kyle McLachlan, makes it his mission to defend the Fremens and to battle for control of his planet and to protect the spice from evil overlords like the Harkonians from gaining possession of it. Have you ever seen the Fremens? The Fremens are kind of like, they're humans, but they seem to also have the distinction of having these like really bright blue eyes. I mean, like really unnatural blue. So much so that even their own irises kind of even have a bluish complexion. And nothing against blue eyes. My sister has blue eyes, but I mean, real unnatural blue. So much so it looks like you could swim in their eyes, like this, they almost look chlorinish like blue. Anyhow, Paul is supposed to be kind of like their savior, and the evil overlords, the Harkonians, of course, would love nothing more than to take over their commodity. And the Harkonians, of course, led by this disfigured and ill-looking guy by the name of Baron Harkonian, played by the late Kenneth McMillan. And there were a lot of quirky characters featured here, including the police lead singer and bassist Sting as the cunning adversary Fayed Ruta. You see, these names kind of sound more Middle Eastern than they do American or European. You see, that's kind of like what many people had complained about in this movie. I mean, yeah, okay, I understand that the whole thing of race identity may be a bit more to the more modern day stages. Back in the 80s, nobody really gave a shit about that. Because back in the 80s, nobody was woke. Today, it is something that a person won't like, they cancel it. It has its good and bad because of, number one, freedom of expression, but number two, just because something you don't like doesn't mean you have to take away from people who don't seem to be bothered by it. If there's something you don't like, don't watch it. Don't look at it. I don't think anybody is really offended except you. If you feel offended, no problem. Don't look at it. Who's stopping you? Anyhow, yeah. Fayed Ruta is, of course, one of the nephews of Baron Harkonnen. Listen, I'm not going to go into a blow-by-blow run-through of the characters because of how dense most of them are portrayed. Yeah, some of them are more developed than others, but they're very, very thinly lined. And maybe this is kind of where things get a little muddled because maybe there might be just way too many characters and they're not really given enough screen time or very little in terms of a backstory. But there are some that kind of stand out to some levels of vast importance. Sure, we have Paul as the leading character, someone who we will be following throughout most of the movie. But even sometimes some of the decisions that he makes can often be quite questionable. I mean, here he's trying to plays off as a vigilante, but sometimes I can't always root for the decisions he makes. We also have his parents, Atreides, Duke Leto Atreides, played by Jurgen Prochnow, and his mother, Lady Jessica, played by Francesca Annis, who both play important parts in their son's quest, especially his mother, Lady Jessica. Let's see, Sean Young. This is one of her more earlier roles. She shines as the love interest for Paul, named Chani, who is a fierce warrior and the daughter of paleontologist Liet Keynes, played by Max von Sydow. And then we also have the leading villain, who is the bulbous and deteriorating, sickly-looking Baron Vladimir Harkonnen, played by Kenneth McMillan, who actually seems to be kind of an entertaining-looking kind of guy because of the fact that he's so over the top in his performance. You know, he kind of definitely has that kind of creep factor in him, while also at the same time, in some areas, he comes across as being somewhat entertaining. He definitely has a lot of the physical capabilities of what a typical movie villain should be like. But also, surprisingly, he also comes across as being, at times, a bit, what you would say, offensive. I mean, it should be noted that this movie came out in 1984, and it should be noted that Dune was often described as being one of the most homophobic movies out there, because when I look at Vladimir Harkonnen, if you ever noticed, he's got these boils on his face, these pock marks on his face, and it makes you kind of thinking, that this guy might probably have, the big A. Yes, the disease of the 80s. The big A. Okay, never mind me talking in riddles. He looks like he has AIDS. With all the physical features, the pock marks, the boils on his face, the sickly features about him. And the reason why I say offensive is because, of course, back in the 80s, everybody used to think that homosexuality and LGBT was synonymous with being evil. But then again, you gotta consider this was the time period, unfortunately. As much as you probably hate to say this, you probably hate to hear this, but, unfortunately, when it comes to telling the truth, not a lot is to be loved. I'm just telling the truth. And those who actually feel offended, I feel offended too. Because it is offensive. And maybe it was meant to be that way. I mean, actually, in the book, he was actually even worse. I think he was originally meant to be played as a pedophile. But I don't think they wanted to go to that extremities, so they just made him into an effeminate guy who had the hots for Sting's body. And yes, Sting does not really come in full costume. A lot of times he's seen wearing almost like blue swimmer trunks most of the time. Okay, sometimes he might wear a robe. But he does expose quite a lot of flesh. Okay, maybe not in the nudity terms, but, But then again, hey, back in the 80s, Sting was, he had the physique. And I'm talking about Sting the singer, not Steve Borden, the wrestler, who was pretty much unknown at that time. Yeah, I know they both have the same names, but I'm talking about the singer. So yeah, that's kind of like what I got out of it. Based on the gargantuan-sized novel by Frank Herbert, adapting it to film definitely was no easy initiative. As I mentioned before, come on now, 600 pages for a 2-hour, 17-minute long movie. But through the effort from David Lynch, which I'll give him praise, he still regrets it to this day ever making this film. He definitely tries to accomplish the impossible, and I'll give him a mutual salute for that there. Just to show no hard feelings. You're selling yourself short there, Mr. Lynch. He still didn't fully succeed. What really saves this movie from being a total train wreck, like I said, the visuals and the atmosphere feels like what would have been expected from Herbert's novel. They got the visuals done right. The acting and performances are a bit hit and miss. Some are more entertaining, but a lot of them were underdeveloped and did not have much of a backstory. And that's kind of like where the red herring stems from, and that was the poorly executed screenplay. And yeah, I'll be honest with you, the acting does not really fare that well. Although I can still show some signs of forgiveness and some sympathy. I'm a nice guy. I might be a little rough sometimes, but I got a heart of gold. And I can forgive Kyle McLachlan, being that it is his big screen debut here. But he just seems very wooden in his performance. Like I said, could be just inexperience. He fared better in other Lynch films like Blue Velvet, the Twin Peaks. And even though Sting's performance was weak, even though all the ladies may have drooled over his sexy body, we can actually be forgiven due to him being that he's a singer, top priority. But then again, some singers actually can act. Hey, David Bowie can also act just as good as he can sing. True. There are a few other ones too who could probably act just as good as they can sing. Mariah Carey, Beyonce, they also know how to act pretty well too. If there was an actual really bad performance here, and even that I could still forgive, it would have to come from Alicia Witt's character as Alaya. And it's not her fault, to say the least. She tried, and it was her acting debut, and she was only just 9 years old at the time. Yeah, she's not that much older than I am. So, this is where the hit and miss comes from, or from these performers. But I can still show some forgiveness, being that they were still in their acting debut, or maybe that acting is just, like I said, not their specialty. The supporting cast, however, actually do manage to pull things off very well, especially with the likes of Patrick Stewart, who had this great commanding performance, which probably may have had people saying, hey, if we're going to do another Star Trek movie, I want Patrick Stewart to be our captain. Because sometimes I feel that there was a bit of a Captain Picard in him, except that he was kind of using mostly a loud voice to his role. But then again, that's probably easily forgiven because of the fact that he has a strong theatrical background. We also have some great supports from veterans like Jose Ferrer, Dean Stockwell, Sean Phillips, Max von Sydow, and Everett McGill. And even though, like I've mentioned before, Kenneth McMillan's Vladimir Harkonian character was offensive and was, a very ruthless individual, I thought even for a villain character, he showed some great levels of entertainment. And I will probably give kudos to him for that. One of the things I also liked too was that the soundtrack was very catchy, especially since most of the soundtrack consists of a lot of electric guitars and a lot of 80s themed kind of backgrounds, as opposed to, like the symphony orchestra type of stuff that you would get from somebody like a John Williams or a Randy Newman or a Danny Elfman type. Still, I thought, the band Toto had some great soundtracks from this movie and some brilliant song contributions from Brian Eno. I also have to say that the creatures that were exhibited in this movie were nicely done from Carlo Rambaldi, who did some great technical work here in this movie, especially with the creature effects. There were many aspects that Lynch wanted this movie to go on a much darker path. And one of the reasons why he had such disdain for this movie was because he did not have enough creative control. He wasn't able to accomplish that. He probably wanted things done a little bit more darker, more grittier, and maybe that probably would have helped. But since he wasn't really given as much creative control to go to that direction, he was like, let's just get this done, collect my paycheck, and let's not never talk about this ever again. Okay? It's no wonder why he dismisses this movie so much. I mean, other movies he actually did get in more creative control. Here, not so much. And though there were some good aspects about this movie, it's still not enough to consider this movie as a classic, in my opinion. So if I was to give this movie a scale out of 10, I would have to give Dune a 6 out of 10. So I guess this ends my writer review. Thank you all for listening in. If you wish to subscribe to my YouTube channel, please feel free to do so. If you wish to leave a comment, go right ahead. But just remember the 3 simple rules. Be kind, be courteous, and please refrain from any rude comments. And I will be back again with another movie review. So until next time, this is Eric Correct Writer saying, keep watching those movies, and I'll see you around. Goodbye.